Hello, everyone. I'm Resnick. I'm the Lease Administrator with the Office of Vehicle Management, and just wanted to take a little bit of time to walk you through some of the components of the Vehicle Request Workbook. First, what I'm going to show you is the instructions, definitions, and context. Before I get into all of this, I want to kind of give a caveat for the workbook, because at any time the workbook could be updated with new information or edits and changes. So you always want to make sure that you get the most recent version of the workbook from someone at OVM, myself or Cheryl Cushman, who also works on vehicle requests. All right, so diving into the instructions tab, I'm not going to read everything. I trust that you can all read what's on the screen or what's in the workbook when you have it open yourself. But just to give a general overview of this tab, we have the first section is instructions. There are some links that are embedded in this page, which will show you, they'll bring you to the different documents that may be referenced within the workbook or have other relevance to the workbook and the request process. One of these here, I'll show the first two, the reviewing Executive Order 594, and the other one here is for reviewing the current fuel efficiency standard document. So these are related to carbon emission or fuel efficiency of state vehicles, and we want to reduce our carbon footprint at the state as much as we can. So we are moving in the direction of things like electric vehicles and hybrids and whatnot. So if you need more information on those, you can click those links and it'll bring you right to those online documents and information. So also in this section, you have links to each tab within the workbook. There are multiple tabs. As you can see here at the bottom, you've got your justification and expected use, your vehicle specs, FES and turn-ins, funding summary approval, and the VH110 vehicles list. And so they're listed here, and there are also links that will bring you right to those tabs as well. So there's a color key we've included just so that you're aware. Any gold colored cell, this darker gold color here, would indicate that that cell is something where the end user yourselves would need to input information to provide us with your request. So the lighter gold colored cells are optional. Both of these cells will then turn white or clear, whatever you want to call it, when the cell is filled in or you put any sort of data into the cell. We've also tried to update the workbook. As I mentioned earlier, it has many iterations. We've made it more extensive over the years, trying to make it easier for end users to add data into the spreadsheet. So if there is something that we could make easier for you by using drop-down lists, we've incorporated those, and you'll see this little drop-down arrow next to any of those cells that have that information. So peach cells, those will auto-populate, and that's based on formulas in the background. So if you see any peach cell that is not populating correctly, you are able to overwrite it, but we ask that you do not, because they are formulas and they should be populating correctly. So it would be probably easier or better to let us know that it doesn't appear to be populating correctly. And then the gray cells are more for instructional or informational purposes as you go through. So in this next section of definitions, there are links within other tabs of the workbook that will bring you back to these sections. So if you get to, in the justification and expected use tab, if you have a question when you're looking to fill in what the usage type of your vehicle is, you can click the link there and it will bring you to this tab, and you can look at these definitions. I'm not going to go through all of the definitions. They're here, and the same thing happens with the justification itself. We're asking for the justification to answer several questions. We do have some of these broken out, as you'll see when we get to that tab, as questions themselves that you can answer directly, but other things that are more in the narrative that you're entering, you just want to make sure that you address all of the items that are here. And then there's contacts for myself and Cheryl, and currently this lists Chelsea Keene over at DOER, However, that will be a different contact very shortly. So that will need to be updated. Okay, so moving on to justification and expected use tab. This is where you can see these gold colorations and peach colors in the drop-down arrows here. So I'm going to just fill this in. I'll say Executive Office Administration and Finance, and I'll choose our own Operational Services Division, and you'll see, as I mentioned, data is populated over time and updated over time. This mentions Alex Giantonio, and we have now had him replaced with Vincent McCosey, so this will need to be updated, but we also don't have any fleet vehicles, so that was not a high priority. So let me, I will choose Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, which will then give me, I'll choose Department of Conservation and Recreation, or say Department of Fish and Game, and you'll see how these will repopulate with information of the appropriate fleet contacts and Chief Financial Officer contacts. Again, this was functionality we added to the workbook to make the workbook easier for people to fill out. And it says right here in the gray informational cell, if this is incorrect, go ahead and overwrite it. And anytime that we say the formula is okay to overwrite, we will put that right on the sheet itself. Right. And walking through just briefly on some of these items, you'll see again, the gold boxes need to be filled in, and a lot of them will have drop-down boxes. And we'll call this a general administration vehicle. And this is for conservation or park support because it's public utilities is the one I chose. Let me see. Say it's assigned during business hours. So again, if you use this link here, click that, it will bring you back to the main page, and you can scroll down and see what these usage types and characteristics mean. We'll go back. Justification and expected use. This is that lighter gold color does not need to be filled in. So you can leave one of them blank or both of them blank, but this one was originally gold, so that does need to be filled in. And this vehicle function, justification for vehicle, this is where you put your narrative in to answer all of those questions. And in these sections here, you put in whether or not there's going to be emergency equipment. So if you've got amber lights you need, and they're going to be installed by the vendor, there's options here. And then once you're done, you do none and NA, and you won't get any more of those gold fields filling in. And again, if we can just say NA here, and it takes out the gold because you've filled it in. We also have drop downs for several of these questions, which are, again, just trying to get at the basic justification for the vehicle itself. So we'll say there are 3 people in the vehicle, just throwing some information out here. Have drop down for the types of roads. This is TPU. They will not be towing, so we'll just say NA, and they're not acquiring a prep package, so we'll say NA there. And we'll say they have a need for 3 of these same vehicles. So once I fill that in, you'll see how this next section has turned gold for 3 of those lines, because you'll need to add that information in. Okay. As a general rule, what we would like to see for each of these justifications is the vehicle performs X functions for X job description. Obviously, you're going to have a much more detailed list of information here, but that's the basic need that we have for this section. What we would expect is that if you need, like I put in a quantity of 3 for this vehicle. If you need 1 up to 15 of a vehicle to perform a specific job function, you can put all of those vehicles into one overall justification request. Each of these section headers that's alternating colors of blue and yellow, and you have up to 6 of these in the workbook. So with each function and type of vehicle to fulfill that function, you put in a justification and a quantity request and all of the information that we're looking for in these columns. And then you can move down and to get to your next function that you need a vehicle to complete and fill that information in as well. So I'm just, for illustration purposes, I'm going to add another quantity of vehicle here so that we have the information. And I'm going to put in unit codes just so we have differences that we can see later on in the workbook. Your unit codes, you may have all of the same unit code using these vehicles or different unit codes. It doesn't matter. As long as the vehicle type is the same, you can list them all in the same section and it's fulfilling the same function. So I'll do 10, 11, 30. It looks a little different from the other. And to walk through some of these, again, we have some drop-down options. I'll say 1 is at the main office, 1 and the other 2 are at regional offices. And here, if it's not the main office, we consider the office location of the fleet manager contact that we have. So that is the address that we're looking for. If it's not that location, then you'd want to put that address in here. Just so that the cell turned white, I'm just putting main office here, and then I'll do 1, 2, 3 Main Street in Boston is the next one, and 7, 8, 9 Spring Street in Worcester is the other. Just so we have some information there. And here I am getting ahead of myself. The street address goes in one column and the city goes in the other. So I'll say this is also Boston, and Boston, and then Worcester. So and if you have regional labels for things, so if Boston is your metro region, then you can put that in there. It's not something that we track necessarily. Some of this information is also simply for your ease of reference back to these requests in the future. So if it's easier for you to say that, you've got a request in for both the metro and the western region for this vehicle type, then it may be easier for you to reference that rather than saying, oh, I got it for the Main Street in Boston location or the Spring Street in Worcester location. However it works for you. Again, we're trying to make this request workbook more user-friendly for the fleet managers that are filling them out. So for this particular section, I'm also going to add driver names here because I did say that there was a usage characteristic of being assigned during business hours. As your reference, I know it says it here in the other section, assigned business hours. That means it's assigned to one driver and it does not get taken home at the end of the day. It sits on the state property overnight. So, and assigned to one driver, we use the 80-20 rule. Anytime one driver uses the vehicle 80% or more of the time, then we call that assigned to that driver, regardless of the occasional use by others. So let's see, I'm going to say, here, I'll just add my name in here. And we'll add Vinny's name in here. And we'll add Cheryl's name in here. Just so we have some data here. And we'll say administrator and director and another administrator. So then we get into how often the vehicle is used. So, and this is very important for justifying your need for the vehicle because we need to understand that the best value for the Commonwealth is actually to have a state vehicle and not to utilize something like a rental through enterprise, because we do have a statewide contract for rental vehicles, or perhaps even personal mileage reimbursement. If you're only doing occasional travel for business, it may not make sense for you to have an actual state vehicle. It may be more costly to purchase and maintain a state vehicle than it is to get the occasional rental or use personal mileage reimbursement. So this is why we're asking for these. Current policy actually states that you have to have a minimum 15,000 miles driven per year expected for each of the vehicles that you're requiring. We are looking to update that policy to reflect either 12,000 miles annually or 80% of working days that it's being utilized. So if you're using it 4 out of 5 days, it makes more sense to have a state vehicle, even if you're driving lower miles, just because of the frequency of use. It makes more sense to have a vehicle on site that is paid for by the state and not something that you're paying, a weekly or daily rental expense for. So that's the reasoning behind these trips questions. So average number of trips, I'm just going to throw some numbers in here to see how it works out. We'll say 5 per week, and you'll see that it populates here. That means it has average utilization of 100% because it's expecting 5 per week means 1 each day perhaps. And then if we only go 25 miles each of those trips, you'll see our annual miles is under the 12,000, but we're hitting the utilization per day that we're looking for. So if I change that to 2 per week for this next one, and you're only at 40% utilization, and if you're still doing the same type of traveling, or even if you're doing a little bit more traveling, twice a week, 35 miles an hour, or even, not miles an hour, miles per trip, 50 miles per trip, you're still under the threshold. And you'll see that this utilization justification cell then it becomes gold, because you'll have to provide a justification as to why you really do need a state vehicle instead of using occasional rental or personal mileage reimbursement. Because just looking at the numbers of trips you're doing and the mileage you're doing, it does not make sense financially to have a state vehicle in place. I'm just going to throw in another set. We'll say this one's really active. They do 10 trips a day, but it's only 10 miles a trip. But that gives them well over the current annual mileage requirement. So they definitely meet the requirements listed in this workbook. So I'm not going to fill this in because I don't know what the response would be for, we're only using it twice a week for, 50 miles a trip. But if you do have a situation, then we would suggest you add that information in here so that we can review it. All right, so the next step would be to look at the vehicle specs, FES, and turn-ins tab. And you'll see here that there are already some things outlined in gold, and that's based on the quantity of vehicles we entered on the prior tab. So because we're looking at each vehicle function, we're expecting the same type of vehicle should be able to fulfill the function every time. So we choose in this first section where the gold thing is, we're going to say that we need an SUV for this, just to throw something out there. For VH110, it's important to note that in the first 3 categories, which are sedans, minivans, and SUVs, only hybrid or better options are available on statewide contract. So when you get to the drop down of the SUVs available, you'll see that some of these are BEVs or PHEVs, which are battery electric vehicles or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. The acquisition number you can get from looking at this VH110 list tab. So I'll click on that real quick so you can see it. This first column will be your actual ID number that you can then use to populate that field on the other tab. So, and then you'll have all of your data points across the page. So if you want to look, you can even have, you've got the filters here. You can filter for your SUVs if you think that's what you need, because you're carrying tools to do the job or what have you. And then that will bring you all of the SUVs. You've got different types or sizes listed here, which is the crossover through small or the mid-size and full size for this particular category of SUV. So we'll say we only need a crossover or a small SUV because we're only carrying a couple of things and we've got the most of 3 people in the vehicle at one time. So as I mentioned, the Executive Order 594 earlier, the Office of Vehicle Management is pushing compliance with that executive order. And so we're doing an EV first acquisition path as our recommended path for looking at vehicles. And that's when we get a request from any agency, that's how we're going to look at it is there a battery electric vehicle that would meet the vehicle needs? That's the needs of fulfilling the function, not necessarily the wants of the drivers. So in that vein, I'm going to go ahead and choose, let's see, we've got a handful of BEVs. So I'll use the filter and find those. And we'll choose, let's see, what's the more, so the best value potentially is the Bolt EUV. So we're going to choose that one as our option. So that is the BEV, CHV, BLTU, so Bolt Utility, and that's BEV for Better Electric Vehicle, CHV for Chevrolet, BLTU for Bolt Utility, and it's the first option of the 2 options on the list of vehicles. And the 08 simply refers to the number of the vendor offering the vehicle. So if I go back to my vehicle specs, FES and turn-ins, and I go to the acquisition number dropdown, I want to be looking at that BEV Chevy Bolt Utility 0108. And so that will then fill in all of the data points that we already have from this VH110 list into the data points required here on this page. And because especially nowadays, we've got a lot of fluctuation and fluidity with what is being ordered when in the auto industry and what is being produced when, we have not added model year to the list itself, because when you're submitting your request, you may be looking at model year 2022, but then when the request is finalized and approved, it may have changed over to a model year 23. So we're going to leave this blank and it can be updated as needed. I'm going to go ahead and put in 23 because I know that the 22 model year is already gone by and we cannot get those any longer. And then you can put in here your exterior and interior colors. So if you want black, on black. And these are just your requests, which we will then use to create the quote form, or you will use to create the quote form depending on which avenue you're going for funding. And if you have different regions that identify themselves in different ways, then you can have the first 2, which are the Boston ones, both black, and then your Western region and out in Worcester, gray if it's available. And we can then work more of that out as we get the quote from the vendor. Again, you've got some more gold cells to fill in over here in the options section. I'm just scrolling over. And basically the OEM options, OEM stands for Original Equipment Manufacturer. That's your Fords, your Toyotas, your Chevys. So any option offered by the manufacturer itself would be considered an OEM option. And that's what you would put in here. You put in, you want floor mats. Floor mats are no longer always included standard with every vehicle like they used to be. So you may need to pay for those. So if you know the cost of them, you can enter it here. If you don't know the cost, we can figure that out at a later time. This is just your initial request that you're submitting. So you want to make sure you at least put in what the option you're looking for is. And I would suspect there are no upfits needed for that vehicle. And we'll stick NA there as well. And we're going to say this particular version, all you need are floor mats. You don't need any other extras, so we're not adding anything else. The middle section here for fuel efficiency standard, because the fuel efficiency standard is currently being updated, we've put a lot of to be determined in this section. But as you can see, these are peach cells that will fill in automatically based on the other data points that are already input by you. And the only thing you need to worry about is if perhaps this says no for meets FES for MPG, then this will turn gold and you'll need to put in a justification as to why you need that particular vehicle and not a more fuel efficient vehicle that still meets the job function that you're looking to fulfill. And then scrolling with the last thing for you to input here are the turn-ins that you're going to be providing. So basically, we would expect these to be replacement vehicles for vehicles that you already have in your fleet. So if you look here on this column header, it says turn-in plate from my agency, and then you have a turn-in plate column right next to it from the Secretariat. So if for some reason there are a couple of agencies in the same Secretariat, they've got programs changing from one to another unit, so you may not actually be replacing things from your own agency. You may be replacing things from another agency, but you're taking on that responsibility of that program. So that's why we've got this extra column. So I'm going to choose just randomly some of these plate numbers that are offered. The plate numbers that show up in this first column from my agency should be plate numbers you're familiar with as the fleet manager because they are your fleet. And if you had to not use one from your fleet, but say this one out in Worcester, that's a program that is coming to you from another area, but it's doing the same job as some of the other vehicles you have in your fleet. That's the whole reason that they're giving it to you instead of this other agency. Then you can choose another vehicle from somewhere else in the Secretariat that is appropriate that you're replacing because you're getting the program. And that's just an example. There may be other reasons that you're using the Secretariat turn-in rather than an agency turn-in, but as long as you've worked that all out with your Secretariat, that's fine to submit that information here on this workbook. And we do ask for the general condition and the current location of the vehicles, and that's for our use of knowing, is the vehicle currently needing a lot of repairs, and so we really have to make sure we get this through very quickly in the process, if at all possible, depending on order timeframes and the review process itself, or if it's in good condition, and perhaps even later on when it comes time to replace the vehicle, you can update this information with us if you've got two of the same vehicle doing the same function and one of them gets into an accident perhaps. So instead of replacing the one you were originally going to replace that's on this workbook today, you could let us know, well, this one was an accident. It wasn't worth it to repair it, so we had to total it out. Now we're missing a vehicle there, so this new vehicle is going to go here instead of being a replacement for that. And so we'll update our records with the total vehicle being your turn-in instead of whatever you've already put here in the workbook. So we're willing to work with you as long as it makes sense. We're happy to make those changes. And then there's another question here that has a little drop down about will the replacement be used for the same job function? And this is where, yes, it's doing the same thing. It's a similar vehicle type, all that sort of stuff. Or if you're in process of consolidation of programs, maybe you're changing from a sedan to an SUV because you now have two programs merged into one because you have vehicles for those programs that are only doing a couple hundred miles a month and it doesn't make sense to keep those just for that specific purpose. But they're an SUV versus a sedan for a different program where you've got, a few more miles being driven on them, but they still have some availability to cover this other job function. But a sedan wouldn't be able to carry the equipment. that other job function requires. So you can let us know in this section, it's entirely different because for whatever reason, we're changing from one program to another, et cetera. Who knows what the reasons are, but you can explain all of that in your justification on the justification tab. But you can also list here that maybe it's doing partially the same thing because you've added one additional job function, like I was just mentioning. It could be entirely different, or it could be exactly the same. The program's running smoothly. They're meeting all the mileage requirements that are out there, and they're doing the vehicle you're using is doing well for you in that position. So there's many different scenarios, and we tried to cover the responses for those scenarios here. And then if you scroll over further, you'll see that there's additional data points. This really is, if you want to look at them to compare to make sure that you did choose the correct acquisition number in the beginning, perfectly happy to have you do that. But this is more for OVM's use because we need these data points to put into our online database system FleetWave so that we have all the information for the vehicles and their specifications, and we can do the correct reporting that we need to do and other management items. All right, so I'm going to do a different type of vehicle in the next section here just so you can kind of see how that changes. So we go to a medium duty truck. We'll say you need a larger 350 perhaps. And so you go with that for the F350. You'll see this information. Same objective for exterior and interior colors that you're looking for, options, their costs, upfits. This is where you'd put in, you need a plow, or you need a sander on one, you need lights on another, amber lights, etc. So we'll just say two with, and it doesn't have to be a one word or whatever. I'm just making a short entry to make the review easier to look at. And this here, the MPG data is not actually relevant because the F350 is outside of the current FES purview. So there wouldn't be anything there. And again, you have the same items here, your turn-ins from the agency or from the Secretariat. So just showing you that you can, each section, you'll have a different vehicle type potentially because it's fulfilling a different vehicle function. So, and as before, you can go from 1 to 15 of the same, and you have 6 different options, functions, sections that you can use to fill those in as a request. Okay. So then moving on to the funding summary and approval tab. This is basically, it fills in which vehicles you've chosen, and it asks you whether you're going to lease them through finance lease through OVM, or if you're going to directly purchase them with agency funds. So, and it also asks you for the account appropriation code and the fund code for these things. For your reference, account and appropriation codes are typically 8 digits long. You may need to contact your finance folks to get this information. Also for the fund code, that's typically 4 digits long. So it's sometimes the same as a unit code, but sometimes very different from a unit code. Again, you may need to reach out to your finance folks to get that information. I'm not going to fill all of this out. It's fairly simple to understand. You've got your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and as I put in a quantity of 3 and a quantity of 5, you've got those gold boxes to fill in for all of that. And then you've got this middle section here for the fuel efficiency standard. Again, there isn't any result here because the fuel efficiency standard is currently being updated. But once that is updated, the formulas in the background will get updated in the section, and you will have a message here in the summary and next steps that will either say, congratulations, you've passed the FAS, or it will say, unfortunately, this request does not meet it, and you'll need to work with someone at OVM and or LBE to figure out other compliance with the standard. And then you've got the electronic signature section at the bottom here. You yourself, as the fleet manager, read through these statements and you put in your name in this first quote box. I'm going to just do it as an example. And you put in the date. So today, data recording 6/30/22, and fill that in, and then you submit it to us via email, either myself or Cheryl. I'm working with lease vehicle requests, and Cheryl works with direct purchase requests. So then we see that you've signed it because you've read these statements. You're basically attesting to the fact that everything is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, that you've already spoken with your CFO or other funding personnel that have the authority to make these requests official, because they're saying they do have money in the budget to make these requests. That's the thing. And then you send it over to us and we will review it, and we'll work with you potentially back and forth if we need updated information, if we have questions, any of that. And then once it's approved by OVM, we will approve by putting our name in this last section and adding the date. And if by any chance you have a requirement to speak with Department of Energy Resources because of fuel efficiency standard issues, then they would review and speak with you potentially, or just review and have other documentation in this workbook and put their name in and the date that they approve it, because they've spoken with you about alternative compliance. So that's mostly it. And like I said, you would then email this workbook once it's complete to either myself or to Cheryl Cushman. And the last tab I have already shown you, which is this VH110 list. This pulls in data from the master list and combis. A note on this is that sometimes combis may have a more up-to-date list because the vendors may have provided the sourcing manager with additional information, whether that be pricing updates or actually entirely new vehicle options that they're offering. So it may be good to look at combis and pull that list first. And once you've identified the vehicle from that list, you can look on this list to see if it is here. If not, you can manually enter the data for the vehicle you're looking for into these lines. And just let us know when you send us the request via email that you did have to manually enter that information so that we're aware.